Welcome to Holistic Information Governance with SharePoint. I'm Nick Inglis. I'm a co-founder of Optismo, the leading information governance consulting group. I'm co-creator of the Information Governance Conference. I've created a lot of models that are in use throughout the Fortune 500, including the Optismo SharePoint Governance Model, the Optismo Relative Data Repository Value Model, the Optismo Information Management Maturity Model, and the Optismo Information Governance Model. There are lots of them. I'm the author of the AIM SharePoint Governance Toolkit, co-creator of the ARMA IGP certification course, and I write for a ton of industry publications as well as US News & World Report and Yahoo Finance. I've got a lot of certifications and certificates to boost my geeky street cred, and most proudly, I'm dad to Connor Adam. My contact information is to the right. You can jot that down and save it for when you need a consulting firm that isn't going to just throw more technology at your problems. Before I get started, I want to thank the organizers of SPBiz for including me in such an amazing event. Putting together events like this is incredibly stressful work, and they deserve all of our thanks for making SPBiz this amazingly successful event that it is. Also, I want to thank the sponsors of SPBiz. When this event is over, click on the sponsors tab on spbizconf.com and learn about all of these sponsors, what they do, and how they could help you. Without their support, educational events like this can't happen, so go visit their websites and figure out what the world of possibilities are for your SharePoint implementation. So let's just start by diving in. I've got this presentation broken up into 4 sections with 2 deep dives, one on information governance and one on SharePoint governance, with a section on information architecture thrown in for good measure. First, though, we need to get all of these terms straight. I know, let's start with a vocabulary lesson. That'll keep the session attendance high, right? Yeah. Okay, let's go into it. Where does SharePoint fit in? We're going to be discussing a lot of terms today, but the highest, most overarching term that we're going to discuss is corporate governance. Corporate governance is all about how a corporation is controlled and directed. Then we have information governance, which is all about maximizing the value of corporate information while minimizing the risk of that same information. Then there's SharePoint governance, which is the application of corporate governance in the platform of SharePoint. And we also have a lot of other governances out there, like IT governance, development governance, data governance, etc., etc. But these are the 3 that we're going to be focusing on today. Corporate governance, it guides the whole organization, and it provides the direction from which all of the other governances flow. Information governance guides how information is utilized in an organization, and it includes these 5 pieces, which we'll discuss in depth in a moment. And SharePoint governance. SharePoint governance is all about applying every other governance in the platform of SharePoint. There are many on the corporate side who would say that SharePoint governance doesn't actually exist, but is instead just applying all of the other governances in the organization. I think it makes sense to have an overall SharePoint governance plan, and we're going to deep dive into the 6 areas of the Optismo SharePoint governance model here in a bit. But before we do our deep dive into SharePoint governance, let's first dive into information governance. This is the Optismo Information Governance Model Framework. It is a model that exists to help organizations develop holistic information governance policies and plans that include everything that we've found to be necessary to the success of any information governance project. And let's start by discussing who should be involved in information governance projects and their specific roles. We have at the top of the Optismo Information Governance Model someone who is leading the Information Governance Initiative, either a Chief Information Governance Officer or an SVP of Information Governance or something like that. To me, it's not about what you're calling this person, it's about what they're achieving. Underneath the IG leader are the various stakeholders, who should, in the least, be providing input on the information governance project, including the business or organization, legal and compliance, records and information management, privacy and/or security, and obviously IT. Under the roles in the model are the structures which enable information governance, the precepts, the concepts, the esoteric which must be understood and in place for information governance success. We'll start with the vast bucket of infrastructure and technology, which includes networks, hardware, software, applications, SLAs, licensing, everything. On the other side of the infrastructure is the information architecture, which we'll discuss specifically for SharePoint in a moment, the taxonomy, and the metadata. The focus of this should be the logical structure of information, how information becomes findable, and how we can support the automated application of information management policies, things like retention, disposition, workflow, etc. And then we add in the concept of an information lifecycle. Now, generally in SharePoint, we're talking about information that is in the create phase or the collaborate use phase of this information lifecycle here. Information moves from creation through to disposal, and as it moves through its lifecycle, certain aspects change. For example, a piece of information or a document might start on a desktop with just a file name. Then it may be moved to a simple shared drive for review. I know we still have not found a way to kill off those stupid shared drives yet. Then it may be moved to SharePoint for broader distribution, where maybe it gets a few more fields of metadata applied, and maybe it goes through a workflow for digital signature. Maybe it becomes a record in a traditional or non-traditional sense and needs to be retained or stored for compliance purposes. Maybe our company gets sued, God forbid, and we need to make sure that no one deletes that piece of information, so we put it on a legal hold. Then eventually we either dispose of it or we archive it. Now, any or all of those last few steps could be SharePoint, I suppose, but in most organizations, it's really multiple systems running in concert with one another. After the information lifecycle, it's necessary to understand how technology will be executed to support information governance, including applications, wherever they may reside, and how they apply information governance. Then there's the hardware, networks, SLAs, licensing, etc., which are not to be treated like afterthoughts. And finally, it's what most people think of when they're discussing information governance, the policies and procedures. Metrics, they help guide the organization in key areas and can be hierarchically leveraged through KPIs to divisional performance all the way through to individual performance. They also can be applied to technology for monitoring and ensuring that other key policies and procedures are being met. Processes that are the core of information governance should be clearly listed and must be consistent. In some organizations, I've seen manifestos around how processes should be leveraged to create efficiencies in this section as well. We discussed roles earlier, but we need to understand who should be following which policies and procedures, who has the authority to maintain and edit them, and who should be held accountable when they aren't followed. Standards from the IEEE, AIM, ARMA, Sedona Conference, and many others are often leveraged as a starting point for many organizations, and we believe that's a wise decision. Metrics and performance are pretty interlinked. Here we want to understand the usefulness of technology to meet business goals. And accountability and decision rights. I like to think of accountability as the enforcement side of information governance, where the decision rights are more around who gets to modify those policies. Alright, that's our deep dive on information governance. Our model is open source. You can grab a copy for yourselves at optismo.com/IG to leverage at your company, consulting firm, wherever. It is open source and available in PowerPoint format. Moving on in holistic information governance with SharePoint, now let's talk about information architecture, because I think it's one of the areas that most organizations really screw up. We've talked a bit now about information governance. Now I want to talk to you about how to architect information in SharePoint to support information governance. Let's begin by defining what information architecture is. I know this Nick Inglis guy loves definitions. And I think the best definition of information architecture comes from Earl Moreau in his 2003 book, Information Architecture, an Emerging 21st Century Profession. In his book, he defines information architecture as a professional practice and field of studies focused on solving the basic problems of accessing and using the vast amounts of information available today. What we're going to focus on here is how to build an information architecture in SharePoint and how to sustain it over the long term. We'll divide this into 3 steps: plan, deploy, and sustain. Planning an information architecture in SharePoint has to begin with the goals of information architecture, and we'll define these goals here that we want to support our users' ability to find content, referred to as findability. We want information architecture to be applied consistently. Since we're using SharePoint for this task, we need to structure our information architecture leveraging SharePoint technology. And lastly, we need to build a SharePoint information architecture that is sustainable for the long-term functioning of our organization. I alluded to it before, but here are our containers. Now, what are these containers? They are our structural elements that contain content or contain other containers which then contain content. These containers are structured hierarchically. Since they're hierarchical, they allow us to establish our policies once and then push them through the hierarchy to affect underlying content. We have two sets of containers that include our site collections, which contain our sites, which contain our libraries, which contain our content, or contain folders, which contain content. We also have our content types, which apply metadata, which is then applied to content. Let's discuss how our content types function as a type of container. Content types are selected when someone uploads a piece of content into SharePoint. We have a choice of content types based on what content types are available for the library into which we're uploading. The content types define the metadata fields or metadata schema that's to be associated with that piece of content. And content types are structured hierarchically and can apply policy. Now, as we're designing our SharePoint information architecture, I find it's best to think about the physical containers, our site collections, sites, and libraries. And then we add to that our taxonomic elements of content types and metadata. Combining these 5 elements, we're able to structure an information architecture that supports our underlying processes, to align our information architecture with business processes through the use of the content organizer, to run workflow, which provide us with defined processes in SharePoint, leverage our record centers and in-place records management, providing processes for records management in SharePoint, multi-stage retention, ensuring that we're consistently applying information management policies and records management policies around the keeping of content, and automated disposition, ensuring that we're consistently applying information management policies and records management policies around the removal of content. It also ensures that we're properly classifying content for accurate and appropriate use of e-discovery tools and litigation holds surrounding our compliance processes. Now let's wrap our heads around this with an example. We'll leverage our 5 elements of information architecture structure, our 3 physical containers and our 2 taxonomic elements. In this example, we have a piece of content that's uploaded to the marketing assets library of the marketing site of the site collection for ABC Division. The content type that's applied to this piece of content is a contract, and because of that content type selection, the user was provided the metadata fields of vendor, contract size, and signer or signatory. From this information gathered from our physical containers and taxonomic elements, we know a lot of information about this particular piece of content without even opening it. And we can apply many of our business processes supporting records management, maybe the use of the content organizer, some workflow, and our multi-stage retention and disposition rules all automatically. And why? Because we know that Jane Smith signed a marketing contract worth $150,000 with XY Consulting for the ABC division of this company, all without opening the document. All right, to plan our SharePoint information architecture, we need to plan our site collections and our sites hierarchically. We need to plan our content types, and we need to plan our metadata. When planning our site collections and sites, we should be mindful that our site collection and site plan should support navigation and the browsing habits of our users. And they should be logical to our users. And we need to plan out where new sites can be created when they're requested by our user population through the site provisioning process. Let's make this more real. Here's a high-level visualized plan of site collections and sites. And in this simple plan, we have 2 separate site collections. Site collection A, site collection B. We have sites of A, B, C, and D with several child sites included as well. In this plan, we also have mapped out where our new sites can be added and created through the provisioning process, which allow us to push hierarchical policies downward through the waterfall of sites. All right, when planning our content types, it's important to align the content types with how they will be utilized in terms of policy and process within our SharePoint implementation. First and foremost, our content types should be used to categorize content. Also, our content types can be used to apply various types of workflow. They can be used to apply retention rules and disposition rules. They can also be used to leverage the content organizer. As you can probably tell, I'm a visual and conceptual learner, so let's take a look at this visualized plan for content types. Now we have three high-level content types of A, B, and C. Those content types are utilized as placeholders, and we can apply high-level policies to those content types. We then have various other content types structured below. We've also included in this plan areas in which new content types can extend existing content types. And this is useful for specific line of business requirements that we may not be aware of at the enterprise level. Our user population can extend our enterprise level content types, taking with them the hierarchical policies that we've already applied, and any additional fields of metadata they can add to it if they already exist. They can't create new fields of metadata, but only apply fields that have been already created at the enterprise level. What's the point of all this? It's to ensure consistency with those enterprise policies and procedures while providing flexibility to the user population so that they can get the work done that they need to get done. Now let's take this high-level visualized plan and put it in a real-world setting. We can now see that we have specific content types for manufacturing, marketing, and HR, just as an example. Under manufacturing, we have specifications and operations manuals. Under marketing, we have collateral, including white papers, brochures, and contracts, including reseller contracts and conference contracts. Under HR, we've got our W-2s and accounting reports, obviously simplified here. But we also have mapped out areas where these content types can be extended. And let's keep this example going, and we'll focus on the manufacturing line. Our manufacturing line of business wants to have specifications for facilities separate from product specifications, something that we didn't plan for at the enterprise level, but no worries because we did plan for content type extension. So the site admin can extend the content type of specification to add two new content types of facility specs and product specs. Facility spec and product spec will have all of the same metadata and information policies of both manufacturing as the highest level content type in the hierarchy, and the metadata and information policies of specs. The site admin could then add additional fields of metadata if they already existed in the system. Maybe they add facility ID to facility specification, and maybe it's product name to product specification. Let's continue our example and build out this piece of the information architecture. We would set as many properties as possible at our highest level content type. In this example, this is manufacturing. For our manufacturing content type, we have associated the metadata of name and created by. We've also established on manufacturing our retention rules and disposition rules. Since we're utilizing manufacturing as a placeholder and not somewhere that we actually want our users to add new content, we've set the content type to not accept new content. We then have created specs, a content type below manufacturing. This content type would receive as a child content type all of the properties associated with the manufacturing content type, including the metadata, fields of name and created by, the retention rules, and the disposition rules. In addition, we've added some additional properties, including the metadata field of spec number, and we've opened this content type up to allow for the upload of content. In our example, we've also prepared for content type extension of the content type specs. Any new content types that extend specs would receive all the properties associated with the content types of manufacturing and specs due to the hierarchical nature of content types. Any extended content types could also add additional metadata fields if they already existed in the system, but we cannot create new metadata fields for the purpose of adding them to an extended content type without going through the enterprise for approval first. Some of the organizations that I've worked with have found it useful to look at the content type deployment in terms of their organizational hierarchy. Manufacturing is an enterprise-wide content type. Specs and operations manuals could be considered divisional level content types, and the rest would be considered business unit content types if it's helpful to visualize in that manner. Alright, finally, I will stop talking about content types, at least for now. Let's move on to talking about the related planning that we need to do for planning our metadata. Why should we plan our metadata? Much like why we plan our content types, we plan our metadata for the purposes of identifying content and findability of content for our users. We can also leverage our metadata often in conjunction with our content types to apply workflow, apply multi-stage retention rules, apply our content and records disposition rules, and even leverage the content organizer based off of metadata. With regards to planning our metadata, Microsoft has given us some key points to consider. Firstly, identify common information types and their required properties. Determine which data elements should be immutable and which can be left to the user's discretion. This will allow us to determine which fields we should apply specific term sets to. Identify by lining up where we are deploying metadata, the syndication requirements, and managed metadata service application needs. What this will do is allow us to determine how and where we're deploying which metadata fields within our site collection and site plan. Likewise, we'll also define our term store roles and memberships to determine where we're deploying which term sets within our site collection and site plan. We will specify any language requirements if we're running a multilingual SharePoint implementation. We'll also begin to form a hierarchy of our terms and group them logically. Finally, we'll do the work of actually creating our term sets and our related terms. So, companies who aren't Optismo clients yet often ask, what does it look like when we're creating our plan for metadata? It generally looks like a giant Excel spreadsheet in which we're entering the field name, the associated content types, the field type, such as text field or a number field or a field where we're applying managed terms. We make some decisions around where we're going to apply those metadata fields. We list the associated term sets if we're managing the field, and we begin to make some grouping decisions to make our list of fields more manageable. And what you see here on your screen is a simplified version of what we use with our clients. Now let's discuss how we actually deploy our information architecture into SharePoint. We'll begin with our site collection and site plan. Our site structure is deployed by the creation of various individual site collections and sites. Those sites should be iterations of site templates so that we can ensure consistency throughout our SharePoint environment. For deploying our content type plan, our enterprise content type should be created through the content type hub, and we may choose to utilize multiple hubs. Generally, this is for the purposes of alternate syndication, to more secure site collections or sites. Now for deploying our metadata plan. Our enterprise metadata field should be deployed using the managed metadata service. For our term sets and terms, we should deploy those using the term store, which is a piece of the managed metadata service. Alright, so in this section, we have planned our information architecture, we have deployed our information architecture, and what remains is what is most often forgotten, and what ends up destroying all of this hard work from the inside if it's ignored. Sustaining our information architecture. To sustain our information architecture, we must prepare for change. What we are creating is much more akin to a blackboard than a stone tablet. We should leverage the tagging of information, search data, and user feedback to modify and improve our information architecture over time. We should establish ongoing ownership of the SharePoint information architecture, and we should establish a schedule for ongoing information architecture review. Alright, 3 sections down and 1 left to go. Are you ready for the SharePoint Governance Deep Dive? For our SharePoint Governance Deep Dive, we're going to be leveraging the Optismo model of SharePoint Governance, which divides SharePoint Governance into 6 more easily digestible sections for SharePoint folks, and ensures that all areas of governance are addressed within the platform of SharePoint. So what is it that we're going to cover in this deep dive into SharePoint governance? We'll start by covering our foundational activities. Now, these foundational activities aren't specific parts of SharePoint governance, but they're activities that must be completed to be able to address the governance areas that you see below. We'll begin with an information gathering, or a pulling together of varied strands of policy and procedure from across the organization. We'll then develop some foundational information which we can build SharePoint governance from. The foundational information sets the tone of how your SharePoint governance plan will be formed. We'll then move on to the guiding strategy, and it's looking at SharePoint in context of the other systems in the organization, and then looking at it from the perspective of where technology is moving in the organization, and then looking at SharePoint from a gap analysis perspective on what functions are needed by the organization that aren't yet leveraged in SharePoint, or maybe needed from a third-party vendor like one of the sponsors of SPBiz. And then looking at SharePoint from the perspective of how the governance project will be guided. We'll finally look at planning our implementation of SharePoint, or if we have already implemented SharePoint and we have it in our organization, cleaning up our implementation. After we've covered our foundational activities, we can then move on to the 6 areas of SharePoint governance in the Optismo model. We'll look at governing the content that is added to SharePoint, governing the design and structure, not just from a branding perspective, but also from an information architecture and consistency perspective. We'll look at how development and extension of SharePoint should be governed. We'll look at the roles and people for SharePoint, moving on to security and its ever-growing shadow on all of the work that we do. And finally, we'll discuss classification of information in SharePoint. And now for the obvious begging question: what is SharePoint governance? If we ask 10 SharePoint experts, we're going to get 20 different answers. And I think that most of the definitions that have been bandied about thus far in SharePoint circles are wildly off base. Now, why is that? Firstly, SharePoint governance is expansive. We've already talked about 6 areas converging to form SharePoint governance. SharePoint governance is big. It needs a lot of elbow room. SharePoint governance reaches all parts of an organization, from the typical worker uploading Word documents to the super IT geek who speaks to his coworkers exclusively in .NET. SharePoint has a lot of touch points throughout an organization. Further on that point, SharePoint is approached very differently by the many stakeholders. For some, SharePoint is a place where content is kept. For others, it's a development platform. For yet others, it's a workflow engine, or a business intelligence platform, or a project management platform, or a fill-in-the-blank. SharePoint can be so many different things that it's approached in wildly different ways. Now, why do I think that the SharePoint community has struggled with this term of SharePoint governance so badly and for so long? Well, for my 2 cents, it's because most of the legacy SharePoint experts come from a development background. And when they toss around the term SharePoint governance, what they really mean is IT governance or development governance in the platform of SharePoint, which, although is very useful and valid, is only a small fraction of what SharePoint governance really is, and it's adding a lot of confusion to the marketplace. Okay, and hopping back off my soapbox, let's talk about how we start off right. We start off right through our foundational activities, which are 1, information gathering, 2, foundational information, 3, guiding strategy, and 4, implementation planning. Let's begin with information gathering. In information gathering, we want to be able to gather data and identify trends about how SharePoint is to be used in the organization. This begins with developing some representative user profiles so that we don't need to ask these questions of every single employee in our company. We align our questions to our gap analysis mapping, which we'll be discussing in a moment. And then we gather the information, either through one-on-one interviewing, maybe it's surveys, maybe we develop some workshops, however you believe it will be the most successful in your organization, and it's usually dependent upon corporate culture. All right, once we've gathered information, we can move on to establishing our foundational information. Our foundational information will establish the role of SharePoint in our organization. It'll establish the role of systems that are cooperating with SharePoint. It will assess the maturity of our organization in key areas and identifies any external factors which may affect our SharePoint governance project. In establishing the role of SharePoint, it's imperative to determine how SharePoint will function in the company. We discussed how SharePoint can be many things to many people. Here's where we determine what SharePoint will be for our company. And there may be multiple answers to this question. We'll then establish the role of cooperating systems. What will connect with SharePoint? What will the data connections be? Will we be connecting through the database or through the data stores? How about UI connections, the user interface? Will we load some other system through an iframe inside of SharePoint? Or connect the UI through federated search? Or maybe load SharePoint functionality through the UI of some other system? Then determine what are the process connections. Maybe an HR system feeds into Active Directory and then creates a SharePoint user account. Maybe when a record is created in SharePoint, that record is automatically sent to a different records management platform. What are the process connections that you'll want in your organization? You'll then perform a maturity assessment. When we do maturity assessments at Optismo with our clients, we break it up into 3 categories. Here are some examples to get you started. Everyone seems to do maturity assessments in their own unique way, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Then finally, you'll want to identify your external factors, things that can derail or delay your SharePoint governance work, like a lack of budget or some crazy policy or compliance angle that needs to be followed. Maybe there's some merger or acquisition or divestiture activity that means that you should put your project on hold to be more effective. Maybe there are other projects like systems replacements that are happening that you should be aware of. I mean, there are loads of external factors. The point here is to go seek them out and ask the questions. Once you've done all of these foundational activities, you can then pull together all of your work into a single document that we like to call a foundational overview document that you can reference throughout the rest of your SharePoint governance work. Establishing foundational information tends to take some time, but when it's complete, you can move on to guiding strategy. Now, I'm not going to go into depth in each of these for time, but guiding strategy, you'll want to develop some guiding principles for your project. Develop a reference architecture of all technologies and how their functionality interacts. Perform a gap analysis if you have not done so already, and then develop a technology roadmap if one doesn't exist in your organization to determine the overall direction of technology in the organization. We then move on to our final step in foundational activities, implementation planning. For implementation planning, you will document your requirements, and there are 100 different valid ways of doing this, so either follow your company's specific guidance in this area or leverage existing standards. And then secondarily, develop a business case and gain approval if you've not done so already. For this, there are 1,000 different valid ways. So again, either follow your company's specific guidance in this or leverage an existing standard. Hey, we've completed our foundational activities. Congratulations. Now it's time to dive into some real SharePoint governance. And at Optismo, we break this down into 6 easily digestible areas. Let's begin with content. I'm going to outline all the aspects here that you should look at. First, you want to work with your records managers, information managers, and or legal department to develop and implement retention policies across all information. To me, it makes a lot of sense in many organizations, if not most organizations, to simply apply records management principles to all information, since lawsuits don't request from companies all of their relevant records, but instead request all of their relevant information. And if you didn't understand what I just said, your records manager and legal team most definitely will. You'll then establish your content type structure and rules, which we discussed a little bit in our discussion on information architecture. Again, from our information architecture discussion, we'll standardize our metadata, or our columns, for those of us still speaking in Microsoft Ease. We'll then establish some library and list standards, and finally we'll determine whether or not the built-in site provisioning process in SharePoint 2013 fits our enterprise needs, or if we are running an earlier version of SharePoint, we'll build our own site provisioning process. Moving on now to design and user experience, we will establish our site organization, which I believe we know how to do in depth from our information architecture discussion. We will establish our branding guidelines, which generally come directly from our marketing departments and then are nuanced to be SharePoint specific. We'll then not ignore the power of site templates. And we will create our own site templates to automatically carry common permissions and functionality with every new site that we create. We'll establish navigation rules, like what menu will go on the top of SharePoint. Should it be the same everywhere, or does it change from division to division, or from site to site? We'll then wrap this up by developing some search configuration rules, which could very easily be a presentation all by itself here in terms of the depth available. Now let's discuss development governance, and let me make a disclaimer. I am not a .NET developer, but I can give you the broad strokes in this area. First, you want to establish your SharePoint environment rules. Generally, there are 3 environments: development, testing, and production. Then you'll establish your code deployment process, or processes. You may have different processes for internally coded solutions, purchase third-party solutions, and may even have a process for configuration changes. Actually, you likely should have one for configuration changes as well. Lastly, you'll establish or simply list out your server topology if you are not already in the cloud. You'll establish or list your applications and application pools, align where they're utilized within your site hierarchy, and then establish or list your storage architecture. And then simply establish or list out your ongoing server management plan. Now let's discuss the next section in the Optismo SharePoint governance model: people and roles. For people and roles, you'll establish or list out your permissions groups. We like to have our clients list out where within their hierarchy of permissions groups there may be extension, instead of creating brand new permissions groups or, heaven forbid, utilizing custom permissions on an individual user, which, by the way, you don't ever want to do. Then, you'll establish your support channels and roles. We suggest that you leverage your site templates or permissions groups to establish tiered levels of support, where the tier provides the initial level of support that's available based on the criticality of either the site or project or the individual. You'll want to also establish or list out the groups providing support, the modes of support that are available within the organization, and not to be forgotten are support metrics. You'll then establish training requirements by user group or permissions group. Everyone should have some type of training available to them, whether it's on demand or formal. Optismo provides end-user training and strategic SharePoint business training for our clients. Finally, you'll establish the roles in SharePoint's ongoing maintenance, answering the questions of who's in charge of things like search configuration updates, site provisioning, support, user onboarding and offboarding, records management, archival, etc., etc. The next section of the Optismo SharePoint governance model is security. Now, for permissions, you are defining who has access to what. Now, I'm a visual person, so for me, I take my site structure chart that I've already created in developing my enterprise information architecture, and I start to simply draw circles on it as I move through the org chart, creating along the way some idea of common permissions. What I'm doing is I'm asking myself questions like, does a person in Department A have access to Department B? And I work my way through. It's a bit time-consuming, but it really is the most effective way that I've found of creating permissions groups. I then take my chart and I simply start adding them into a permissions Excel sheet that we utilize. For administrators, there too should be a specific hierarchy. Utilize inheritance to establish admin roles and permissions. Microsoft had a really useful administrators and owners worksheet for 2010 that I'm still utilizing today. You can probably still get it off of TechNet. Finally, you'll set up rules around the creation and modification of user permissions so that you, unlike most organizations, have a good handle on your user groups. We are now at the 6th and final section of the Optismo SharePoint governance model, classification. For classification, you'll start out by establishing any forced consistent classification. What I mean by this is to establish, only if you must, any classification or naming standards that are forced. These rules generally come from your records managers or from a specific regulation. Organizations that are in highly regulated sectors are often the ones that have these types of rules. If you are not required to have a specific forced classification scheme or naming standard, thank your lucky stars, and simply move on. We talked about content type grouping in some depth when we were discussing information architecture, but most of the time I'm utilizing content type grouping to ensure compliance with retention and disposition standards. Oh, and if you're talking to records managers about content type groups, you can refer to them as big buckets if you want them to be on the same page as you. For the managed metadata service, you want to have processes and usage restrictions for adding or changing enterprise content types. Otherwise, you lose consistency and lose findability of information. You'll want to also define the processes and usage restrictions for extending enterprise content types, something that we discussed in our information architecture section. Are you seeing how everything works its way back to that information architecture section? It may also be helpful to list out some scenarios for which adds or edits may be made. Also, as a side note, forms and workflow are always helpful for approval type processes. Alright, you'll now want to establish how the content organizer can be used. Things like records management, workflow, fulfillment, processing, publishing, and the like are fair game. Also, feel free to utilize the content organizer functionality in conjunction with forms and workflow if you're feeling like a true SharePoint champ. And folks, that's it. We covered a ton of ground today. We started out by defining our... And folks, that's it. We covered a ton of ground today. We started out by defining our terms to help us understand where SharePoint fits in the world of corporate governance and information governance. We did an information governance deep dive leveraging the ever-popular Optismo Information Governance Model Framework, which is open source and available for download at optismo.com/ig. We then discussed at length information architecture in SharePoint to enable information governance. Then we wrapped up with our SharePoint governance deep dive based on the Optismo SharePoint governance model. I, my friends, am Nick Inglis, and I want to thank you for all being a part of this session today. My contact information is available right here. So if you'd like to jot it down, feel free. I'm here to answer any questions you may have. Thank you once again to the organizers of SPBiz, and you have a great rest of your conference.